In the heart of a forgotten city, shrouded by dense fog and decaying memories, stood St. Vincent Asylum. The building had once been a place of healing, but now it loomed like a malignant tumor, its faded bricks mottled with black mold and shattered windows that whispered ancient secrets. It had been abandoned for decades, left to rot after a mysterious epidemic claimed the lives of nearly all its patients and staff. Since then, local legends whispered of dark presences lurking within its walls, presences that no one dared to confront, except for 5 young thrill-seekers, Lily, Jake, Marcus, Sarah, and Tom. The group, fascinated by the supernatural, often ventured into places said to be haunted. But St. Vincent was different. It was not merely haunted, it was damned. Armed with flashlights and cameras, the 5 found themselves at the asylum's rusted entrance one chilly October night. "Are you sure about this?" Lily asked, her breath visible in the cold air. Her voice wavered slightly, betraying her nervousness. Jake, the bravest, or perhaps the most foolish of the group, forced a grin. "What's the worst that could happen? We hear a few weird noises, catch a ghost on camera, and become YouTube stars." Sarah tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out strained. "Yeah, just a normal night of ghost hunting," she muttered, more to reassure herself than anyone else. Tom, the oldest and most skeptical, shook his head. "Let's not get carried away. We'll do a quick walk through, get some footage, and get out before we end up in a documentary." As they stepped inside, the air changed, stagnant and heavy, with the acrid scent of bleach and decay hanging in the atmosphere. The flashlights barely penetrated the darkness, casting trembling beams across cracked tiles, overturned gurneys, and walls scrawled with cryptic graffiti. It was as though time had stopped here, trapping the building in a perpetual state of rot. "Let's start at the basement," Jake suggested, his voice brimming with forced bravado. "That's where they used to keep the morgue, right?" The 5 descended a narrow staircase, their footsteps echoing ominously through the corridor. The lower they went, the colder it became. When they reached the bottom, the flashlight beams danced across old steel doors that marked the entrance to the morgue. A chill ran down Lily's spine as she saw that one of the doors was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. "Let's just get the footage and get out," Marcus said, his voice tight with unease. Jake pushed the door open and they stepped inside. The room was expansive, filled with rows of body drawers and the faint metallic smell of dried blood. An old surgical table sat in the center, its leather straps brittle and broken, stained with substances too dark to be rust. As they ventured further, something caught Lily's eye, a flicker of movement in the corner, like a shadow detaching itself from the wall. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Before the others could respond, the temperature in the room plummeted. Their breaths fogged up the air, and a low, guttural sound resonated from one of the body drawers, as if something was struggling to breathe within. The flashlight beams swung to the source just as the metal door of the drawer slowly slid open on its own, releasing a burst of frigid air and a rotting stench that burned their throats. Inside was not the corpse they had feared, but a mass of something far worse. Twisted bones and sinew seemed to grow from the drawer, forming a grotesque figure that crawled out with unnatural movements. Its face, or what remained of it, was a horrific patchwork of decayed flesh and gaping eye sockets that seemed to bleed shadows. It opened its mouth, but instead of a scream, a chorus of agonized voices erupted from it, echoing off the walls like the cries of 100 souls damned to an eternity of suffering. As the terror escalated, Tom noticed a narrow hallway leading off the morgue and, in a desperate bid for escape, shouted, "This way!" He bolted down the corridor, driven by the primal urge to flee. Sarah hesitated only for a second before chasing after him, her breaths ragged with fear. The others watched helplessly as the pair disappeared into the darkness, their flashlights bobbing erratically until the light was swallowed by the gloom. Tom's feet pounded the tile floor as he ran blindly through the dark hallway, his pulse thundering in his ears. He could hear Sarah's footsteps behind him, but didn't dare slow down or look back. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning like a maze. Just as he thought they'd never find a way out, Tom's flashlight beam landed on an open door marked Treatment Room 13. Tom skidded to a halt, panting heavily. "We'll hide in here," he said, pulling Sarah in after him and slamming the door shut. They leaned against it, their chests heaving in the suffocating silence. The room was filled with old medical equipment, covered in dust and stained with something dark and unidentifiable. There was an operating table in the center, tilted slightly as if it had recently been in use. Tom's eyes drifted to a flickering fluorescent light above, casting sporadic flashes that only served to disorient him further. Suddenly the air became suffused with the rancid odor of burning flesh. Tom gagged, turning to Sarah. "Do you smell that?" Before she could respond, the light overhead burst, plunging the room into darkness. As Tom's flashlight flickered back to life, his beam illuminated the far corner where a figure stood. A man in a surgeon's gown, his face hidden by a cracked surgical mask, the skin of his exposed hands charred and bubbling as though burned alive. "Get away!" Tom shouted, but as he backed up, his feet stuck to the floor. Looking down, he saw his shoes sinking into a pool of viscous black tar that was seeping up through the tiles. The ooze crawled up his legs, its cold grip tightening like iron shackles. The surgeon approached, and with each step, the skin on his face peeled away, revealing glistening muscle and exposed bone. He raised a scalpel, its blade catching the dim light. Tom struggled to free himself, but the tar was unyielding, pulling him deeper as though trying to devour him whole. The last thing Sarah saw before she fled was the surgeon leaning in close to Tom, his voice a guttural whisper. "You'll feel everything." Then the scalpel plunged downward, and Tom's screams were abruptly cut off by a sickening squelch. Sarah ran until her lungs burned, not daring to look back. She stumbled down another hallway that seemed eerily familiar, as if she had somehow ended up back near the morgue. Panic clawed at her throat as she realized the asylum was twisting itself around her, leading her in circles like a predator toying with its prey. She found herself in front of a door labeled Children's Ward. She hesitated, the door creaking open as though inviting her in. Against her better judgment, Sarah entered, drawn by a faint, melodic tune echoing through the ward. It was a lullaby, the kind mothers sang to soothe restless children. But in this place it was anything but comforting. The ward was dimly lit by a row of flickering nightlights shaped like cartoon animals. Beds lined the walls, each one occupied by a doll dressed in a tiny hospital gown. The sight was unnerving enough, but when one of the dolls suddenly sat up and turned its head toward her, Sarah screamed. She backed away, but the door slammed shut behind her. The lullaby grew louder, now mingled with the faint sound of children whispering. She turned to see a small figure at the far end of the room, a little girl with long black hair, her face obscured as she cradled a lifeless doll in her arms. "Are you lost?" the girl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's throat tightened, and she took a cautious step forward. "Who are you? Do you need help?" The girl looked up, revealing hollow, blackened eye sockets that dripped thick streams of blood. Her mouth opened, but the voice that emerged was not that of a child. It was deep, guttural and filled with malice. "We all need help." Suddenly the dolls in the beds began to twitch violently, their limbs snapping into grotesque angles. They sprang to life, crawling towards Sarah like twisted marionettes, their tiny hands reaching out with fingers that seemed far too sharp. She backed away, but they moved with unnatural speed, their broken limbs scuttling across the floor like insects. Before she could react, the little girl was upon her, her small hands clasping around Sarah's throat with a grip far stronger than any child could possess. The girl's mouth widened unnaturally, revealing rows of needle-like teeth, and she bit down on Sarah's neck. Blood sprayed across the doll-lined beds as Sarah's vision dimmed, the lullaby twisting into cruel laughter. The dolls dragged her limp body beneath one of the beds, and the darkness swallowed her whole. Back in the corridor, Lily, Jake, and Marcus had no idea of the fate that had befallen their friends. They had heard Sarah's screams echoing through the halls, but no matter how desperately they searched, they couldn't find her. The twisting corridors of St. Vincent Asylum seemed to stretch on forever, warping and bending as if the building itself was alive, leading them away from each other and toward darker, more sinister places. The air grew colder, thick with an oppressive sense of dread, and each distant sound, every groan, whisper, and shuffle, felt like the asylum taunting them, savoring their fear. "What is happening?" Lily cried, her voice trembling, as they turned yet another corner, only to find themselves back in what seemed to be the same corridor they had just left. "I don't know," Marcus answered, glancing over his shoulder. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. "But we have to keep moving." A sudden crash from the darkness behind them sent the three into a panicked sprint. They burst through a set of heavy metal doors and stumbled into a large open room, the old cafeteria, where rows of long tables and overturned chairs filled the space, covered in dust and dark stains. The door slammed shut behind them, and a flickering light overhead buzzed to life. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faintest echoes of their footsteps. As they ventured deeper into the room, the lights began to hum, the sound growing louder until it was almost a painful vibration in their skulls. The light dimmed and brightened erratically, casting long, unsettling shadows across the room. From the corner of the cafeteria, something moved, slow and deliberate. A figure emerged, dragging its limbs with a grotesque, jerking motion. It was a patient, or what was left of one, still wearing a tattered hospital gown. Its face was distorted, eyes hollow and sunken, with bloodless lips twisted into a grotesque grin. "Run!" Jake shouted, but as he did, the lights cut out completely, plunging the room into pitch darkness. Lily fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking. When she finally clicked it on, the beam revealed that the figure had closed the distance in an instant, now only a few feet away, its gnarled fingers reaching out for her. She screamed and stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding its grasp. Marcus grabbed a metal chair and swung it at the creature, the impact making a hollow metallic clang. It staggered back momentarily, but then seemed to grow stronger, its movements accelerating. More figures emerged from the shadows, their pale, skeletal forms filling the room, slowly closing in. The three friends turned and fled down another corridor, their footsteps echoing louder and louder, as if the asylum was amplifying the sound to mock them. The hallway seemed to stretch and twist, leading them deeper into the bowels of the building. They reached a dead end, an old service elevator with its rusted gate hanging halfway open. With no other choice, they squeezed inside, pulling the gate shut behind them. Jake frantically pressed the buttons, and the elevator lurched to life, shuddering as it began its slow ascent. The dim light inside the elevator flickered, casting a dull glow over their terrified faces. As they ascended, the elevator groaned, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. Suddenly it came to an abrupt halt, jerking violently. The lights went out. Panic surged, and Jake fumbled for the flashlight again. When it clicked on, the beam illuminated the elevator's narrow confines, and the shadowy figure that now stood inches from them. It was the surgeon, his scalpel raised, and his face a ghastly mask of decay. He lunged at Marcus, grabbing him by the throat with one skeletal hand and lifting him effortlessly off the floor. "Marcus!" Lily screamed, reaching out to pull him back, but the surgeon's grip was unyielding. With a swift, brutal motion, the scalpel plunged into Marcus's chest, carving deep as the surgeon's hollow eyes seemed to glint with satisfaction. Blood sprayed across the elevator walls, and Marcus's body went limp, his eyes staring vacantly into nothingness. The elevator doors suddenly jolted open, and Lily and Jake were thrown out into a dark hallway. They landed hard on the cold floor, the impact knocking the breath out of them. The elevator doors slammed shut behind them with a metallic crash, and the hum of the elevator resumed, carrying Marcus's lifeless body back into the depths of the asylum. "Marcus, no!" Jake muttered, his voice breaking. He turned to Lily, his face pale with shock and grief. "We have to get out of here, now!" The two stumbled to their feet and ran, the endless corridors twisting around them as if the asylum itself was tightening its grip. Their flashlights flickered, the beams of light growing weaker with each step. The air seemed to thrum with a malevolent energy, and the whispers grew louder, filling their ears with a chorus of voices, voices that seemed to be calling their names. Finally, they reached the main entrance hall. The massive double doors stood before them, slightly ajar, and beyond them was the foggy night, an escape from the nightmare that had claimed their friends. They pushed through the doors and stumbled outside, gasping as the cold night air hit them. They didn't look back. They couldn't. St. Vincent Asylum loomed behind them, a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky, its shattered windows like blackened eyes, watching their every move. For a moment they stood there, breathing heavily, struggling to process everything that had happened. Just as they turned to leave, a faint voice drifted out from the asylum, barely audible but unmistakably familiar. It was Marcus's voice, calling out from somewhere deep within the building. "Stay with us." The voice faded into a low, sinister laughter, and the asylum seemed to shudder, as though settling into an uneasy silence. It was patient, its darkness vast and unending. St. Vincent Asylum would wait for more souls to wander into its grasp. It always did. The laughter died away, and the fog around St. Vincent Asylum thickened, cloaking the building in an eerie shroud. Lily and Jake exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. No one would ever believe what they had experienced, and there was no way to explain the horrors that lurked behind those walls. All they could do was leave and never look back. As they stumbled down the cracked pavement of the asylum's driveway, the cold air biting at their skin, they could still hear faint whispers carried on the wind, like echoes from another realm. It was as if the voices of the lost souls trapped within St. Vincent were following them, seeping into their very minds. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, as though the shadows themselves were reaching out, trying to pull them back. Jake pulled Lily closer as they walked, his hand trembling in hers. "We're safe now," he whispered, though the words felt hollow. The weight of what they had witnessed and the friends they had lost hung over them like a curse. When they finally reached the edge of the asylum grounds, Jake stopped and looked back one last time. In the distance, through the swirling fog, the asylum stood like a silent sentinel, its looming shape blending into the darkness. For a moment he thought he saw a figure standing in one of the broken windows, watching them. It was hard to tell through the haze, but the silhouette looked familiar, like Marcus. Then the figure was gone, vanishing into the blackness as if it had never been there at all. Lily tugged on his arm, her voice breaking the silence. "Come on, Jake. Let's go. There's nothing for us here." Jake tore his gaze away from the asylum, and they continued walking, disappearing into the night. But as they left, St. Vincent Asylum remained, its presence lingering like a deep scar upon the landscape, a place forgotten by the living but not by those who had perished there. And within its rotting walls the darkness stirred once more. In the faint light of a flickering bulb, the shadowy figures of the surgeon, the little girl, and countless other lost souls drifted through the halls, awaiting the next visitors who would stumble across the asylum and become part of its never-ending story of terror. St. Vincent Asylum was never truly empty. It breathed, it waited, and it fed on the fear and suffering of those foolish enough to enter. The whispers continued, echoing endlessly within the walls. "Stay with us." And so the asylum waited, patient as always, its dark history, ready to ensnare more lost souls, adding to the legion of forgotten echoes that haunted its decaying corridors. St. Vincent would never be satisfied. It was always hungry.